Welcome to today's webinar titled The Intersectionality of Race, Culture and Gender in International Arbitration, Lessons from Interdisciplinary Scholarship. My name is Lizzie Chan, and I'm a board member of Arbitral Women, a co-director of Young Arbitral Women Practitioners, and an associate at Three Crowns. I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. And before we turn to the substance, I'm pleased to introduce to you the organization behind this webinar, which is Arbitral Women. And it's in particular, it's under 40 group, which is the Young Arbitral Women Practitioners. Arbitral Women is an international NGO which is dedicated to uniting and promoting women in international 93. Our membership of over 1,000 women from all around the world come from at least 40 countries, and our core work is carried out by 20 board members. Arbitral Women is a proud signatory of the Equal Representation in Arbitration Pledge. This is a call to action for all members of the arbitral community to take specific and concrete steps to help address the underrepresentation of women on international arbitral tribunals with a view to achieving full parity. We welcome all of you to join Arbitral Women. So let me give you a flavor of the events and programs that we offer for our members. These include publishing content that features leading women in dispute resolution in our newsletter, news alert, and on our website, promoting our members' professional achievements and speaking engagements on our website, in our news alerts, and on our social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. We also host, organize, and support events that reflect our mission to promote women and diversity, just like this panel today. We also offer a professional mentorship scheme and host parental discussion fora. We also report on diversity initiatives in the workplace, and we also educate the international community about unconscious bias, including through our bespoke training program called the Arbitral Women Diversity Toolkit. In my role as a co-director of YORP, I lead Arbitral Women's initiatives for its under 40 membership. Our activities include running webinars just like this one, which seek to encourage ongoing conversations about gender diversity and diversity more generally. We also offer a skills training program for our membership, and I would invite you all to look out for the Mazars workshop on financial reporting fraud and international arbitration on the 7th and 9th of December. Now, there's too much to cover in the space of a few moments, so let me invite you to visit our website, www.arbitralwomen.org, and follow us on LinkedIn to find out more about our programs and how to join. I also thank our supporting organizations for this webinar, which include the ERA Pledge, Young Practitioners Subcommittee, Racial Equality for Arbitration Lawyers, Transnational Dispute Management, and Careers in Arbitration. I'm now very pleased to pass the floor to this webinar's creator and moderator, Umika Sharma. Umika is an Indian qualified lawyer currently writing her PhD at the National University of Singapore. I also thank Umika for her enthusiastic organization of today's event, and I thank our speakers for their contribution. So over to you, Umika.
Thank you, Lizzie, for the opening remarks and your kind introduction. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers and let them take the discussion forward. Our first speaker is Dr. Joshua Karton, who is an associate professor and associate dean for graduate studies and research at the Queen's University Faculty of Law in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Our second speaker for the day is Dr. Emilia Onyema. Dr. Onyema is a professor of international commercial law at SOAS University of London. She is qualified to practice law in Nigeria as a solicitor in England and Wales, and is a fellow of Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Our third speaker for the day is Dr. Swethaa Ballakrishnen, an assistant professor of law, and by courtesy of sociology, Asian American studies, and criminology, law, and society at the University of California, Irvine. Last but not the least, we have Louise Woods, who will bring in a practitioner's perspective to this discussion. Louise is a partner at Vinson and Elkins in London. She is the vice president of Arbitral Women's Board of Directors and also the chair of YORP. I extend a warm welcome to all our speakers. And to keep this discussion dynamic and engaging, we will have short discussions after every presentation. We're also aiming to keep the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So now, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Karton to start off the discussion. Dr. Karton, over to you.
Thanks, and hello, everyone. I'm grateful to Arbitrawoman and Yop, and especially to Umika and Lizzie for inviting me to speak today. Diversity is a topic that I've been thinking about for a while and working on more recently. And one of the things that's really struck me is that in some ways, although the context has changed, the discourse hasn't. So for almost as long as there has been a movement to promote diversity in the arbitration profession, people have complained that the movement is one-dimensional. And indeed, until recently, it seemed that the only people who were really benefiting in practice from an invigorated diversity agenda were white cisgendered women from the global north. But that's actually not the kind of one-dimensionality that I want to talk about today. My goal is to persuade you that diversity is not just about the arbitration profession. It's not just about expanding opportunities for diverse practitioners, important as that is. Actually, though, I think diversity is far more important. So there are at least four, I've identified four, distinct interests or values that diversity can serve in international arbitration, and four different kinds of diversity needed to serve those interests. Only by thinking about diversity in four dimensions are we, I think, going to be able to make real progress and to achieve a degree of pluralism that will be self-sustaining. So the first dimension is the one that we typically hear about in connection with the word diversity, and that is the interest served of fairness within the profession, providing equal opportunities for people who look less like me and more like most of you to enter the field, to advance within it, to be appointed as arbitrators. To address this goal of diversity, fairness to the profession, what we need is not diversity per se, but rather equity, to break down the barriers that hinder women, people of color, people from the global south, other underrepresented groups such as indigenous peoples, from entering the field and taking on positions of leadership. Greater attention to these issues is an excellent development and overdue, but it still just deals with fairness to arbitration lawyers. And as long as that continues to be the only aspect of diversity that gets attention, the discourse will remain one-dimensional. So let's move to the second dimension, which is diversity in the service of fairness to the parties. It's a curious and I would say frustrating thing about all the diversity talk that we usually get in the arbitration field, that the parties are forgotten. After all, arbitration is literally for the parties, certainly not for the lawyers. In our system, parties have the right to choose their arbitrators. And what that means in practice is that each party has the right to appoint a party-appointed arbitrator, depending on the appointment procedure chosen, or at least to negotiate for an arbitrator who, although independent and impartial, understands and might even be sympathetic to their point of view, even if they don't approve of their conduct. And most importantly here, the parties are entitled to define for themselves what that means to have the kind of arbitrator that they want. If parties cannot get an arbitrator sympathetic to their perspective because the pool of candidates doesn't contain any, well, then they're deprived of their right to have a tribunal constituted in accordance with their agreement. To achieve this dimension of diversity, what we need is a community of arbitrators who are diverse, demographically, but also in terms of professional background, expertise, cultural and religious commitments, and so on. Only then will disputing parties from all parts of the globe, all industries, all cultural sectors have equal access to potentially sympathetic arbitrators. The third dimension is one we hear about mostly in the context of investor-state arbitration, but it also applies in commercial arbitration, which is diversity in the interest of the legitimacy of the system. Nothing is more corrosive than the feeling that a dispute resolution system does not treat all participants fairly, and the lingering perception that arbitration is a closed club of business lawyers, where insiders exchange professional favors while furthering the interests of multinational corporations. That's harmful in itself, even if it's much less accurate than it used to be. To achieve the goal of preserving and reinforcing arbitration's legitimacy, we need a diverse profession so that anyone can see that the field is not oligopolistic or some genteel form of neo-imperialism, or even just that it isn't narrow-minded. It would also help to reduce conflicts of interest within the community by expanding it and making it less club-like, which would further advance legitimacy. The kind of diversity needed to address this goal is representation. The international community needs to be able to see itself represented in the field. And finally, the fourth dimension of diversity is in the service of higher quality decisions. It's a characteristic of all collective decision-making that it tends toward groupthink. When every member of a tribunal, every member of an arbitral institution's governing body comes from a similar background, their shared assumptions mean that they will also share blind spots. They may not make mistakes often due to their expertise, but when they do make a mistake, it'll be a big one because they won't see it coming. How do we avoid the pitfalls of groupthink? Research on corporate boards of directors points at least one way. Disrupt the cozy in-group mentality by disrupting the cozy in-group. Adding even one contrary voice can improve outcomes to a measurable degree. A diverse voice within the group questions assumptions, provokes second thoughts, and most importantly, forces everyone else to justify their conclusions. So you get better decision-making, not necessarily because the choices made are better, but rather because the group avoids disastrous choices. So to achieve this fourth goal of diversity, what we need is diverse thinking. Demographic diversity can be a good proxy for diversity of perspective. It's often a very good proxy because we are all shaped by our own lived experiences. But in the end, it is only a proxy. And so I think what might be the stiffest challenge for arbitration as a professional community is, even as we uphold high standards of ethics and competence, to learn not just to tolerate iconoclasts and rebellious spirits, but actually to embrace them.
Thank you, Dr. Karton, for that thought-provoking presentation. Louise, do you have any comments, questions from a practitioner's perspective on this?
Thank you, Umika and Joshua, for your presentation. That was really fascinating. And I think fairness within the profession, the first of the four dimensions that you cited, is the one that we most often as practitioners talk about, because selfishly, it's the one that we think about first and foremost. And certainly as a woman practicing in a still male-dominated arbitration world, it's the one that I suppose I first came up against as an aspiring young arbitration practitioner, and looking around me thinking, how am I going to make it as an arbitrator and as a partner at a law firm as a woman? And so I think we're all well versed in sort of the reasons given for, you know, wanting and pushing for equity within the profession. Also, the fourth dimension that you touched upon, higher quality of decisions, so diversity in thinking. I think sort of I came to realize a long time ago that the more diversity you have within the group, the better the outcome generally for the client, because as you quite rightly identify, people's perceptions are challenged, people are forced to think outside the box that they would normally constrain themselves within. And so I think that as well is recognized. But your second and third ones were the most interesting to me, perhaps because they're the ones that I've given the least thought to up to this point. And I think you are absolutely right. Diversity in service of fairness to the parties should be first and foremost in our minds as well, because at the end of the day, we are service providers as lawyers, as arbitration practitioners, and we're acting in the best interests of our clients, the parties to the arbitration. So I'm very interested to hear that one, and also diversity in the interest of the system as well. And I think we're probably all of us on this webinar familiar with the criticisms that are levied at particularly investor-state arbitration for exactly the reasons that you identified. And so I suppose if I had one question for you out of your very interesting remarks, it would be, I'd just be interested to hear from you how you think, and obviously, you know, being a practitioner, perhaps my perspective is slightly different, but how you think we really drive change and sort of diversity away from this closed club. We've all heard the expression pale, male and stale when it comes to arbitrators, and improvements are being made. I think we'll all agree, but too little and perhaps too late. You know, what can we do to sort of push things along, move things along? Have you got any suggestions on that front?
I think what I would say is that often the suggestions that are given take the form of telling people to be more conscientious. And I don't think that works, because people are conscientious and the system doesn't change for the most part. I mean, there are bad actors in every group, but most people aren't. So what you need is systems that force people to go down the paths of thinking more broadly. So for example, I'm really encouraged by the growth, especially in Asia, but other places as well, of more regional arbitral institutions. I'm encouraged by trends that show that when arbitral institutions make appointments, they're more likely to choose diverse arbitrators than the parties are. And I think this is, it's not ill will, it's market forces in motion, right? The parties have to answer, the lawyers have to answer to their clients, and they don't want to take a risk on the clients. I mean, there was an old saying that nobody ever got fired for choosing IBM, right? No one ever gets fired for choosing, loses their client for choosing a brand name arbitrator. So we can't depend on law firms to make those choices unless and until we get to the point that the law firm leadership are as diverse as the world. So I think you have to use rules, you have to use systems to break up, soft oligopolies, not forcible oligopolies, but what amount to that. Oh, I should mention there's something that the Canadian branch of the Chartered Institute recently started. It's too soon to see how successful it will be, but I think it's a great idea, which is to join aspiring diverse arbitrators with senior figures and get the parties' permission to have the more junior person shadow the arbitrator and be present in the proceedings. And it just gets past that, sorry, I don't know you thing that is such a difficult thing for people to get their first appointment as an arbitrator. You might be great, but I don't know you, right? So I think those kinds of programs have the potential to make a difference. Like I said, it's too new to see if it'll really work, but I think that's the kind of thinking that we need. I'd be very interested to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Umika, okay, go on. Okay, can I just sort of say a few words? I think a couple of things that we do need to think about. And for practitioners, is we need to query who are the parties, who makes this appointment. We know that practitioners are gatekeepers, and we know that it is the shortlist that practitioners come up with, which they recommend to their clients, that eventually rule the day. The second point is, I think we need to critique a little bit this continued narrative that nobody gets blamed for going to IBM, because the parties themselves, commercial parties themselves, are pushing for diversity. If you, some time ago, we keep reading all of this in the press, Coca-Cola and Co. And so we can't continue to say that practitioners are being risk averse, and so they do not want to put forward new names. I think that narrative is overspent. It is no longer valid because of the way, the center stage that this discourse around inclusion really has taken off. And so I think I don't particularly agree with that. I think we need to rethink that. I think that's just rolling the wheel. The second thing I think we need to rethink is the male pale stale. It's becoming female pale stale as well. And we need to challenge that, because there is no point, we continue to engage with this and then we run away with one aspect under the cloak of diversity, but we're all back to square one. It isn't, if we're pushing for the profession to open up. And so I like the point you made about your third dimension, the legitimacy of the system and the representation of the international community. That goes way beyond the gatekeeping exercise. My personal opinion is that the gatekeeping exercise that most practitioners do is actually more selfish. So we can give it a fancy name of the market trying to determine and whatever sweet and acceptable description we want to give to it. But it's basically being protectionist. Because of course, you open the field, people don't get as many arbitrations as they used to get. And so that's something we need to call out and call it for what it is. I'm quite happy to hear about the Canadian Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. It would be the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators bringing back the old form of mentorship, because that was what mentoring was about. I did it in the early 2000s, where you're effectively, incidentally with a partner from Vinson and Elkins, you're effectively attached to a senior practitioner, and you get to sit. I actually wrote an award that, not for the parties, but for myself, that my mentor looked at and gave me comments and feedback. And it's not just that, oh, who is that person? I don't know. But your mentor can actually open doors onto you. And which brings me to the last thing I want to say, which is we have to get to the point wherein I can say, when I'm approached, I have enough arbitrations on my plate. There is some lady that I know who is equally very good. She's Umika, or whoever else. We must be able to make recommendations, and we must be able to turn down speaking opportunities, to turn down appointments and say, I can recommend X, Y, Z. We have to do that if we want to get this discourse moving any quicker. Umika.
Thank you, Dr. Onyema. That was actually very interesting. And that brings me to your presentation next. So over to you.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Okay, great. Thank you so very much. So my research, and I've been asked to speak on, basically focuses on race. And my research focuses more on geographical dimension, looking at the role of African practitioners, arbitration practitioners. And what led to this research is sitting at conferences. So I'm an accidental academic. That's the way I like to refer to myself, because I come from the world of practice. And sitting at conferences and hearing people say, oh, there is no expertise from the continent, or people don't know about arbitration, and you sit there and you're scratching your almost bald head and wondering that this is inaccurate, because I come from the world of practice. And I do know that there are people who do arbitrations. And so I set about trying to figure out, okay, let's empirically look at this and find out what is on ground, what happens on ground. And that was what led to what I currently, part of what I do, which is the Arbitration in Africa research project. Our 2018 research project, the idea was to figure out, hear the voices from the continent. Who is out there doing what? And what we found is that there are quite a number of people doing arbitration, a lot of them legal practitioners, but most of them do not have experience in international arbitration. The other interesting thing is that the complaints we have on the international plane replicates itself in the domestic plane, so that in each country you have those who do arbitration and who are engaged even in international arbitration, who seem to have, again, monopolized the market to themselves. And the other thing we found was that knowledge and expertise is not uniform across the continent. And so, I mean, we're talking about a whole continent. We have different languages. And one thing with arbitration is that arbitration, as we would all possibly all agree, is closely tied to economic activities. The greater and the more commercial or economic activities happening within a particular region or space would most likely give rise to more arbitrations, and then you get experience. And so, so we were able to find that. But what was interesting was the reasons the African practitioners themselves were fully aware that they were underrepresented in arbitration. And so one of the things we then asked, why do they think they were underrepresented? I prefer to read this actually. And the top 3 reasons they gave is that the poor perception of African arbitration practitioners by their foreign colleagues, not the parties, by their foreign colleagues, as lacking in expertise and experience. And all of that is from anecdotal evidence, so-called anecdotal evidence. So you have one bad experience, you trumpet it, and the whole world hears about it. And then all the 99 excellent experiences you've had, you shut your mouth and you lock it up in the closet. And so we have that. And then the bias by appointers in favor of foreign counsel and arbitrator. And I have written to the effect that there's a greater opportunity of appointing a foreign arbitrator when you have foreign counsel. It's not rocket science. We can see the connection simply because most foreign lawyers, you know people who look like you. Those are the people you interact with. You know people who work within your circles, within your spaces. We know that in arbitration, we're still heavily dependent on personal references. So if somebody says, oh, we're thinking about appointing Emilia, and they know Joshua or they know Louise or Swethaa or Umika, they will say, what do you think? Have you worked with her? We're more comfortable that way. So clearly, if none of you have ever heard of Emilia, regardless of how wonderful she might be, you're going to be like, I have no clue, don't know who that person is. But one of the good things, so let me digress a little bit. One of the good things that actually, as a result, we now have as a result of COVID and the pandemic, is this ability for people to link up virtually. And so we're seeing lots of new faces, new names. We're hearing people at various webinars and conferences. And so we ourselves were widening and increasing our network. And then the third thing, so going back to the report, the third thing they said was Africans not appointing fellow Africans as arbitrators, and that is huge. Because African governments are the major players, even in international commerce, with state-owned enterprises and entities and things like that. And the challenge that I throw to African governments and their lawyers is, it makes zero sense for you to leave your lawyers in country and fly to wherever, usually your colonial partners who dominated you all these years. You fly there, you get yourself a lawyer, and the lawyers come back to the continent and ask for local experts. That it makes no sense. You can't incorporate and ask for co-counseling. And that's one thing that a number of law firms, at least here in London, are also doing, international law firms. We're beginning to see more co-counseling happening, and that is always helpful. Because of course, remember what I had said, your sphere of influence, your own network. If I'm co-counseling with Swethaa or whoever, what I would know more different people, possible arbitrators to appoint, and she would have trust and confidence in my recommendation. She would know a different cohort of people to appoint, and that would help. And so going back to what I was asked to speak about is, again, having established through research, given empirical evidence, the underrepresentation. For us, the next question was, what can we do about this? And so we then moved on to the African Promise, which we borrowed from the Equal Representation in Arbitration. They kindly allowed us to adapt their wording. I think that's really important because ultimately we're all moving in the same direction. And so the women have tried something that actually works. At least there's been an impact when we look at the statistics from institutions. And if that works, and their willingness to share that knowledge so that we're not reinventing the wheel. So that led to the African Promise, which is effectively a promise online that people can sign up to. I'll try and I'll put it in the chat. People can sign up to. And the idea with the promise is really making a commitment that when you do have an arbitration, especially for now, we said, again, going back to the market forces, that one that is connected to the continent. But I sit as arbitrator in arbitrations that have nothing to do with the continent. But again, maybe because I'm sitting here in London. And that goes back to, how do you define an African? I'm Nigerian, but I live in London. I work in London. My contacts are primarily international. Would you really define me as proper African? And those are questions that we might want to engage with later on. We have the African Promise. And the other thing we're looking at is we then began to look at the pipeline. One of the things you would notice if you've been to the Vismut is initially was the lack of engagement of African students. And then we now have few African students, African universities that come to the MOOT yearly. And so we said that, well, we can set up a charity that can support the knowledge, the learning of African students, again, to try and even up the playing field. And that's how we came up with the Arbitration Fund for African Students, which is a charity here that works primarily with young members groups who have closer access to students on the continent. And the last thing I want to say, which I really think we would support for us, is actually two things. One is the Africa Arbitration Association. They recently started a mentoring scheme, not too dissimilar from the one the Canadians started, which we're supporting very closely. And the second one is the ICC Open the Door scheme that would start in 2022. And they're starting with African young practitioners, but they will open it up to all young practitioners. So there are lots of things that are being done. So I want to conclude by saying that from our own research, the key where we are at now is, how do we measure success? How do we measure impact, that all of this is making an impact and that we're moving in the right direction as Joshua had set out. Back to you, Umika.
Thank you, Dr. Onyema. That was a very interesting presentation. Louise, what are your thoughts as a practitioner on this?
Thank you. I completely agree. That was fascinating. And I'm so glad you mentioned the ICC Open Door initiative, because I think it's a really great one, and it's something that I was going to mention if you hadn't. I just think I'd pick up on a couple of points. The first point you made about underrepresentation generally, and the reasons for it, and obviously I think, for African practitioners as a whole to be viewed as lacking in experience and expertise is clearly a sweeping generalization and a complete misconception from my experience of doing work in the continent. But the underrepresentation, I think I have seen manifest in the following scenario. So as Lizzie mentioned at the outset, I'm Vice President of Arbitral Women, and in that role, I sit as chair of YORP, the Young Arbitration Practitioners Group. And we have, in the course of my time with Arbitral Women, gone through several rounds of appointing steering committee members for the Young Arbitration Practitioners Group. And we are so keen to have an Africa-based member of our steering committee, but very unfortunately have not received applications from African-based practitioners. And so I wonder if there is a degree of perhaps imposter syndrome in African practitioners, hearing people sort of play down their experience and their expertise and sort of absorbing that and feeling like they shouldn't be applying for these positions because they lack the experience or the expertise. In the same way that as a woman, I'll openly admit, I very often question my own ability as an arbitration practitioner, as a partner in a law firm, etc. So I'd be very interested to hear your views on why you think perhaps we're not seeing people come forward, because clearly there is the expertise there. And you know, I have met many African arbitration practitioners with significant experience and expertise. The other thing I was going to pick up on is your point about co-counseling and how useful that can be. And I just wanted to underscore that point. I have very recently co-counseled with a number of not just Africa-based practitioners, but practitioners in other jurisdictions. And I think you have to make a distinction between different types of co-counseling. So in practice, you very often see the big law firms sort of referring to co-counseling as farming out discrete questions of what they call local law to the practitioners based in the relevant jurisdiction. And I think that is not the co-counseling experience that we should be striving for, or indeed that produces the best results for the client. And my experience of a true co-counseling relationship where the two firms sort of act as one and drive the strategy together and consult on all aspects of the arbitration are not only the best for the client, but actually result in sort of building those stronger relationships, such that I now have contacts that I would feel absolutely comfortable sending clients to without my involvement, recommending arbitrators off the back of those co-counseling relationships. Nothing beats sort of rolling up your sleeves and doing a merits hearing with another law firm together. So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that and draw that distinction from my experience in practice.
Thank you very much. Co-counseling, what you said, I completely agree. And again, with the complaints and I think one of the things we sort of forget is the fact that most of this, we actually talk about them openly, makes a difference. And even in co-counseling, the complaints we've continually raised that it's not a question of basically using your domestic partner as as a research field or plant. You send them that question, you want them to tell you what the local law is, and they send it back. That's not what we mean. And that practice is also changing. So I'm really grateful to hear the comments you've made. On the young arbitration groups, I agree with the point about the imposter syndrome, possibly. But one of the things that your group can do is identify those that can do the work, and actually invite them. And they invite them and say, well, we would want to invite you to join our group or something, And that is one way of, again, breaking that link. And once they become a party or a member of the team, is saying to them, these are the concerns we have. They would know many more volunteers, people that can help you begin to grow your community, just as you've said, you've described with co-counseling. Umika.
Dr. Karton, do you have any comments on this?
One little observation. What Dr. Onyema was describing really matches some of my own experience in interviews that I've conducted in a variety of countries, most sort of intensively in Egypt. And there's often, from, in particular, the Egyptian practitioners that I'm thinking of that I interviewed, they make a kind of a distinction between the international, which is seen as sort of more sophisticated and more modern, and the local. And something recently, an experience brought me back to those interviews, which was I was chatting last week with a young lawyer who's writing an article trying to begin a global history of international arbitration. And one of the things that came up with our discussion is that you can't have a global history of international arbitration without it being a post-colonial history. And that those colonial networks, legal networks, political networks, economic networks, continue to be a very powerful force on both sides. So, you know, the paternalism of lawyers from the former colonial powers, sort of farming out only what they see as discrete local issues to co-counsel. But also on the other side, you know, imposter syndrome is not the unique province of people from the global South. You know, I have my own share of insecurities. The difference is that I know that nobody is imputing to me lack of competence because of how I look, right? And so the difference is how we feel about how others perceive us. And that's also something that's very much part of the post-colonial experience.
Thank you, Dr. Karton, for that very interesting point. And this is something that even I've noticed in my research, and currently I'm writing my paper on regional diversity. And because I primarily focus on the narrative of diverse practitioners, they have again and again shared with me how they feel pigeonholed into a regional specialist kind of an image, as opposed to an internationalist image, even though, and I'm not citing any names, but I've spoken to practitioners who've never lived in their home jurisdiction where they qualified and have been based out of London or Singapore or New York, and they still get pigeonholed into their country or their nationality identity. So that's actually a very interesting point that we have drawn from your comment and also from Dr. Onyema's research. So now I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Ballakrishnen for their research. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Umika. And thanks. I mean, I've learned so much from all of this, but it's also making me think just one point before I start my presentation. Louise, to your point on the imposter syndrome, it also made me think of how it is possible that people don't trust the logic of why they're being asked, right? So it's not just because of the reinforced post-coloniality in all of these spaces. There's a sense that it does more for the institution asking to do diversity. It serves their ends because they seem really cool and progressive and movement forward, but actually doesn't have individual ends. So one of the ways in which to change that is to actually change the scripts of what you actually mean by that inclusion and what it can do for them, right? And I found this across, you know, I do a lot of network studies and I don't do arbitrators in specific, but it's been interesting to watch the lack of trust is actually could be read as imposter syndrome, right? But it's actually just, they don't think this is going to serve them because these networks haven't traditionally served them. And I think that's something to put on the table too, as we're thinking of the complicated ways in which to make these bridges. Sorry, I didn't mean to take us back to that conversation, but it's so interesting to listen to this and also to think through how clarifying it is across contexts, how these logics of stratification keep popping up. I am going to share my screen because I am at that point of the day where if I don't have a screen, I'm going to forget what I want to say, but I'll keep this very short. I don't work on, I'm not a practicing arbitrator. I don't work on arbitration, but I do work on gender and diversity and inclusion in the legal profession. That's what I write on. That's sort of like the main research interest that I have across the many books that I've been working on recently. And the most recent book, the book that I'm going to talk about today, is this Accidental Feminism book, which thinks through the ideas of representation when there isn't intention. So a lot of my earlier work was followed along the lines of what we were talking about here, which is what do you do when you have intention, but it doesn't have good outcomes? And this book does the little bit of a flip, which is it tracks very elite Indian law firms to trace what happens when, despite not having really thoughtful intention, they've happened to produce gender parity across very, very high ranks. My work more generally thinks through like globalization and, you know, the logic of inequality in institutions and the way it travels. But the important thing that I want to sort of think through here, and I'm a theorist, so it is slightly different. I'm glad I'm going right at the end because everything you said reinforces ideas of theory for me, right? I keep thinking of what are these global markets? What are their priors? What are the implicit biases? What are the things we can actually change? And what are the things we're never going to be able to change? There are just some things you can have a policy, you can start a program, right? But if you don't change the implicit biases that are set in so many of these spaces, you're not really going to have any engagement that moves forward. the big empirical puzzle my work. So early in my dissertation, so this book comes out of my PhD dissertation, and early in it, I had a woman partner in a large law firm in India who also happened to do arbitration say to me, like, I don't understand why you keep talking about diversity and gender, right? Like, why is gender diversity? Like, this is something the global north has. This is not a problem we have. So stop superimposing global north problems on the global south. We actually don't have that internal problem. And so, as a skeptical sociologist, my first response was that, of course, this must be because, people who are successful always think they don't have problems, right? Like, it's very easy to think you don't have problems if you're successful. But the data actually started to show that actually gender didn't matter very much in a lot of elite law firms. So litigation practice still works like an old boys club. That's where a lot of the arbitration practice is. But around the same time that I was doing this work, a colleague was doing work on the demography of the legal profession and found that India, I don't know if you can see where my mouse is pointing, probably not, but India is right at the bottom of that list. Like, the lowest line there is the feminization of female attorneys in India. And despite this, in the top law firms, women are at about 55%, right, at entry, and they're about half at partnership, even senior levels of partnership. And that, the contrast of that, especially given the narratives of gender, the narratives of diversity that you hear in every other context, was incredibly striking. All of us know that gender usually gets reproduced in ways that are super feminized, or they get produced in ways that are not really very elite, right? And complicated with that are ideas of caste and colorism and ableism and urbanism, right? All of these things that are invisible that we don't really talk about. But are central to how to think of even one kind of global South woman, right? There isn't one kind of global South woman. Like, the intersectionalities within that logic are so clarifying. And part of what then happens is when you're seeing it from an international lens, because it checks the box of a global South person, you're not doing actual thoughtful critique of what is that diversity actually showing you? Because if it's just reproducing somebody with an elite degree that has cosmopolitan experience that looks a certain way, then you're really just replicating another version of an ideal type that now happens to be South Asian, right? And so these ideas of diversity and replication come up a lot in my work, but it was frankly very striking to see how distinctly different this was than the existing argument. So the main argument of the book is sort of fourfold. I'm going so fast because I want us to stop and come back to it, hopefully at some point later. But one of the ways in which practice was defined in India was, contrary to a lot of the conversations we've been having this morning, the first part was that it was very local firms that had the best advantages. It wasn't international firms. International firms had the luxury and legitimacy to come into the country and say, how it is in India, India is terrible, right? So I contrasted it with, large consulting firms and large banking firms, because India has a closed market for legal services. So you don't have a lot of Indian, you have no law firms that are not Indian. But the firms that existed, right, could replicate and say, well, of course, we're trying to do gender better, but India is so terrible, how it is. And because they had the legitimacy, no one thought it was because of the firm that gender was so terrible in their firms, right? They just assumed it was because of India's terrible culture. But domestic firms that didn't have access to that legitimacy had to overperform this idea of meritocracy, and they had to overperform this idea of cosmopolitan equality, which then made them do what I call speculative isomorphism, right? They had to overreach to be on the same par. And the people who were advantaged by it were individual women, right? So this idea of how to think about spaces that we traditionally think of as deemed to have bad outcomes actually could have good outcomes because there are no expectations off of them is sort of one of the big findings of the research. But the second finding I want to highlight is this idea of who your clients are. Another thread that's been coming up in the discussions this morning is how clients see you and what expectations they have. And one of the expectations that were, because there was no set expectation of what a cosmopolitan lawyer that did transactional work was, because of the nature of work and how new it was, a lot of the clients started to reshape what they valued. I'm so glad we put value on the table when we started talking, right? Because it's not so much whether clients want you. There's a line of research that says client will use diversity for diversity's sake and ask for it depending on their own diversity. But the interesting thing is whether they value it, right? So it's not whether they sign you on, it's whether they actually think you're valuable in that representation. And I say this because I think that's something that you have to work over time with your clients for, right? Like it can't just be at the entry. It has to be a sustained relationship that gets reinforced. And this is why things like mentoring, this is why things like, open networks of diversity are so central. I do want to I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm trying to do like a 10-year project in 5 minutes. So I'll keep this very quick. But I will say, one of the ways in which I was thinking of what does this really mean for, this arbitration logic, right? Like how can you extend it to other kinds of work? And the first is really to reimagine who you think of as the ideal worker. That's not hard. That's true across sites, right? If you think of this as capable of reimagination, then thinking through what would be a truly equitable, to go back to Joshua, your point about, the four dimensions, I think of it not just as like an intersectional 2D 4-dimension, but almost like a, moving up in space to have weight, to be a specific kind of experience for what you think of as the ideal worker. The second is really to interrogate how much people mean it when they say intention. I know that sounds really skeptical, but I think especially post-colonial global South citizens that are now been accepted because we form and adhere to cosmopolitan global norms, need to re-question how much of this is actual intention versus how much of it is movement possible making. And I think it's a hard thing to do, and it requires constant self-evaluation. The third is sort of the power and the peril of optics, right? So on the left is I'm sure everybody's seen this, like it was a PR FOPA like a couple of 2 years ago. Wow, it seems like it was, COVID's made me lost track of time. But anyway, so it was a couple of years ago. And the distinction in the rhetoric, right, changes how you even think about whether it's true. This is actually a firm that's not very bad on diversity metrics, right? But because of the way in which this came out, it became the place in which to have this entire conversation about diversity. And I think that changes how we think about who is being represented and how we think about what that representation should look like, and how real equality is going to have to come from moving beyond the perils of like optics, because that's easy to do. And that's definitely the first step. But yeah, I'm going to stop here, but I'm really, really great. I mean, I'm grateful to be here, but I'm also just really grateful to be able to think through these ideas across contexts and see how resilient and sticky they are. And that gives me like sort of both a sense of distaste for the futures that we have, but also hope, right? Because there's ways in which to build together and think through together. And I think intention is the first step of like thinking through a lot of these questions. So I'm really, really glad to be here.
Thank you so much for that very fascinating presentation. So I'll hand over to Louise for her comments on this.
Thank you. I was trying to keep up with you there. I'm so glad, first of all, that you said that COVID's made you lose track of time, and it's not just me that's happened to. I suppose I wanted to just come back to your idea of the ideal worker and just get you to unpack that a little bit more, because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, there's a line of research of thinking through how every workspace has specific ideas of what they think of as the ideal worker, and sort of how inequality stays is by changing the metrics on which that inequality gets done, right? So this idea of like, this old white man with contacts is like just one version of it. Like that person could look different now, but they're still the ideal worker because they have the core characteristics that you find attractive for that space. And so really thinking through what we're expanding or including with inclusion is hard, because oftentimes those scripts of what an ideal worker is don't leave. So in a lot of the examples that you were using, I mean, that my co-panelists were using in empirical research, this idea that, a global person is going to know more, they're more sophisticated, right? Those are scripts that you can't undo. And because you can't undo them, they're scripts at both sides that then reinforce what a good ideal type is. And that makes it really hard to sort of be subversive in those roles, even if the institution starts to include them, right? So there's a capitalist model of like, there's this idea of like racial capitalism that gets done, but I also think of it as like identity capitalism, right? So the organizations get to say, hey, look at the people we're introducing and including, but those that are being included or being referred to think, I am so grateful for this person for doing X because I don't deserve to be it, right? Because that ideal type is still in the minds of everybody that's being included. And moving past that is sort of, I think, necessary, but also really hard to like unpack.
I think that's a really interesting comment, and it kind of makes me think about how, I mean, I'm sure many of you who practice in arbitration or in any law firm really have heard talk of this, but the women who succeed, who make it to the top, who make it to partnership, for example, and I focus on women just because obviously that's what I identify with, but it's are those women succeeding because they are making themselves more like men? Are we minimizing our family life? Are we sacrificing time with our children, for example, if we have children, in order to mold ourselves more into what the ideal worker looks like within the organization that we work with and for? And I think that's really interesting, because then you start to come back to, well, have we really progressed, or are we morphing ourselves into this sort of ideal worker for the sake of career progression? And I don't know how you deal with that. And I do think, when I think about myself, I do think, you know, in the professional context, until very recently, I would have done as much as possible to minimize the existence of my small children. You know, I mean, there's no way I wanted them hanging around the office or in the background of video conferences. Thankfully, actually, I think COVID in some ways has improved some of those things. I'm sure there are plenty of ways in which it set us back as well, and we don't have time to talk about all of those, but I do think there have been some sort of COVID-driven changes in recent years that hopefully mean that we are more understanding and appreciative of the diversity amongst us all. But I'd be interested in hearing from any of you on more on that.
I think for me, can I throw something else in the mix? Why do we think that every single female who works in a law firm wants to end up being a partner?
Well,
not you, Louise. It was general. Until we've had that question. We had a meeting of, you know, so-called women at the top sort of event, and the women in the law firms were talking about the steps they were taking to support younger colleagues, you know, to make partnership, blah, 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 and all of that. And maybe because again, the freedom that comes from being an academic, I think there's some degree of freedom that we have as academics that unfortunately, you know, lawyers, practitioners do not have, but it tells in our bank accounts. So we understand it's a fair deal, Louise. And so the key, and I just said that one of them was talking about a particular young female practitioner and how disappointed they were when the colleague came in and said they were quitting and they were going because of family and all of that. And she felt really, really bad. She felt as though she had failed. And I just asked the question, why is that not success? If that is what she wants, why do we think that, oh, everybody wants to become a partner, or unless you become a partner or a professor, you're not successful in your career path? I think there's something wrong with that.
I would agree with that. And I also think there's a problem with this idea that your career is linear. So certainly in private practice, there's this idea that it's up, 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 up until you decide you don't want to go up anymore, and then you're out. And whatever out may be, whether it's because you decided you don't want to work anymore, or you want to become an academic, or whatever it might be. And I think we need to stop trying to make everybody follow essentially what is the track that white men came up with 50 years ago, when when, you know, they weren't having to worry about other responsibilities, for example. So I think that's a big issue.
Can I just weigh in as a white man who decided that the law firm partnership track wasn't what I was interested in? No, seriously though, I mean, the observation I wanted to make is the problem I have with the whole concept of inclusion, which has become one of the buzzwords. We go beyond diversity to inclusion. Well, inclusion still has the connotation that I am letting you into my thing. And that's not really what the goal ought to be, right? The goal ought to be pluralism. The goal ought to be human thriving in all of the different ways that people define for themselves how they want to thrive.
All right, so this has been such an interesting discussion so far. I think we can try to squeeze in one question from the audience if there's one, or I'll just start off with my closing remarks and spend the next couple of days unpacking everything that we have discussed on this excellent panel. So if there's a question anywhere, I don't see a question on the chat, but we are at the end of our hour now. So thank you so much to everyone for taking out the time across varying time zones to join in this discussion. And thank you so much for giving us so much to think about and so much to unpack here. And let's hope we can get this excellent group of scholars for another webinar, maybe for 2 hours, where we can discuss, unpack a lot of the discussion points that we have here. But till then, I would thank all the panelists and also the organizer, the team that has done all the background work, and of course, Arbitral Women for their excellent support in organizing this webinar. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a good week and weekend ahead.